My lecture is going to be on African Americans during Reconstruction. So the title is Reconstruction, the Unfinished and Overthrown Revolution. And it's got that title largely because a lot of the developments that happen that are unfinished and that are revolutionary and that were overthrown are related to African Americans. And so that's going to be the focus of a lot of what I cover. So, key questions. What did Reconstruction entail, especially regarding African Americans? How did African Americans want to reconstruct American freedom after slavery and the Civil War? And I also want to cover the second founding, that's Eric Foner's concept, which we'll get to, and look at what it achieved. This is that revolutionary transformation of American freedom and democracy that we see during this period. And then I want to cover how Reconstruction ended. Reconstruction is largely understood as the policy measures that are designed to help reunite the country after the Civil War. And it's well known for this increase in federal power and control over states, especially regarding citizens' rights. It's well remembered and sometimes reviled for the fights for political supremacy between the president and Congress. And a big component of it related to the Southern states are going to involve returning the seceded states to the Union fold and rehabilitating, and in some cases punishing, ex-Confederates for secession. Related to African Americans, what we're going to see is Reconstruction really involves the overseeing the transition from slavery to freedom and the final integration of African Americans into this body politic. And so what we see during this period, this reconstructing of American freedom, is this rights revolution, where American civil, political, social, and legal rights are newly defined. And so what we see is that more rights are defined and more protections are extended to more Americans than in the period before. And so a lot of these are going to be driven by African Americans and their allies, but African Americans are not going to be the only beneficiaries of them. All Americans will be eventually. So I think it helps to talk about Reconstruction in different phases when I'm teaching it to students. And so the first phase is Wartime Reconstruction, which starts under President Lincoln during the Civil War. The first part of it, or one of the first parts of it, is going to be the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the people who are held in bondage, who are still in the areas that are where rebels are still fighting come January 1st, 1863. But that doesn't abolish all slavery. It's going to take the 13th Amendment to do that. The other part of Reconstruction is going to be Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. And what we know is that Lincoln he really prioritizes reuniting the country and moving past the Civil War. So he has a fairly lenient plan for Reconstruction or readmission to the Union from the seceded states. And he essentially says that 10% of white Southerners need to swear loyalty to the government of the United States, and then they'll have their rights restored. And then their states will eventually be able to sort of come back into the Union fold. There are members of Congress who believe that 10% of white Southerners swearing loyalty is not enough. It's not enough to make up for the Civil War. It's not enough to make up for the almost 1 million dead. And so what they insist upon is they try to pass this bill. It's called the Wade-Davis bill, which will require 50% of white Southerners to swear loyalty to the government of the United States, and then to promise to recognize African Americans' right to vote. President Lincoln thinks that that's a bridge too far, and so he vetoes the bill. And then he refuses to sign it, which amounts to a pocket veto. Lincoln's assassination ends wartime Reconstruction. So this moment that we see where there's a precedence for a system of leniency towards Reconstruction or towards the seceded states is going to be something that's going to be fought over between the president and the Congress in the period going forward. Another part of this sort of wartime Reconstruction is going to be the 13th Amendment, which says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so what the 13th Amendment is going to do is abolish slavery once and for all. So it's universal slave emancipation. And it's needed, the 13th Amendment isn't enough because it doesn't abolish all slavery, or excuse me, the Emancipation Proclamation isn't enough, and it doesn't abolish slavery everywhere. There are all of these local laws that enable slavery, and so the 13th Amendment is needed to sort of clear out all of those local laws that are enabling slavery once and for all. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands is going to be yet another part of this wartime transition. The Bureau is established to help ease the transition from slavery to freedom, and they're designed to sort of manage the abandoned and confiscated lands during the war. What we'll see them do during Reconstruction is serve as a buffer between Southerners. So they're a buffer between the planter class and poor landless whites. They're a buffer between the former slaveocracy and newly freed people. So they're going to spend a lot of time managing that negotiation. And there are a lot of records, including records from Texas, to help students understand the fights over freedom, the fights over Reconstruction during this period. And many of those are available, easily available online. What African Americans want after slavery is justice. They can't get the stolen lives back. They can't get the stolen labor back. But what they believe they should have access to, what they believe they're deserving of, is the righting of those wrongs. And we're going to talk about what the righting of those wrongs entails. And some of that means ensuring that all Americans have access to the same rights and privileges, regardless of race. And so for many of them, for many African Americans, the fight to make freedom real for all is just beginning. The 13th Amendment is not the end, it's the beginning of the real work of freedom. Because there are a lot of debates over what freedom is supposed to mean. The 13th Amendment only says that slavery shall not exist. It doesn't define the status of free people. It doesn't sort of spell out their rights and protections and privileges. And what African Americans know is that they can't assume that they're going to enjoy the same rights and privileges as their white counterparts, because Black people who were free before the Civil War didn't enjoy those same rights and privileges. So what they are hoping is that once slavery is fully abolished, that they will be able to sort of experience true American freedom. And that's what they're going to fight for. And the reason they have to fight is because there's going to be a lot of white resentment, not only in the Southern states, but across the country, over the Southern defeat, the Confederates' defeat in the Civil War. There's a lot of resentment over slave emancipation, and there'll be even more resentment over African Americans and their allies' push for equal rights. And so African Americans want justice, but in order to get it, they're going to have to go through this gauntlet of white opposition. And this opposition to a reconstructing of American freedom, to not only abolish slavery, but to make sure African Americans and other Americans enjoy the same rights, irrespective of race, it's going to be, this sort of resentment is going to be bolstered by President Andrew Johnson, who's going to want to, as we'll discuss, quickly pardon ex-Confederates and give them back their confiscated lands, et cetera. And so over time, this resentment is going to build into an insurgency against the rights revolution that we're going to see. And it's going to morph into this war after the war that's going to bring down the policies of Reconstruction that advance the rights of African Americans. And we're going to cover that. Presidential Reconstruction occurs under Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson is conservative, he's in the Democratic Party, and he, like Lincoln, believes that it's time for the country to move forward after the Civil War. And so what he wants, what he requires of Southern states is that they revoke declarations of secession, they swear loyalty to the government of the United States, that they ratify the 13th Amendment. And once they do this, they'll receive pardons and they'll receive the return of all of their non-human property, so all of their land, et cetera. And once they do this, all of their rights will be restored. And then they can reconstruct freedom. They can deal with African Americans, newly freed people, however they see fit without federal interference. So that's President Johnson's plan. In response to this sort of sense of leniency, that they won't really pay a price for secession, and that if they just swear loyalty, whether they mean it or not, they're going to be able to get all of their land back, they'll be able to get all of their rights and privileges back. What Southern states, Confederate states moved to do, former Confederate states moved to do, is to quickly restrict African Americans' freedom and to ensure that they remain available as cheap, exploitable labor. And so what we see is that they do things like take the old slave codes, which had regulated enslaved people's lives from cradle to death. And some states, all they do is take out the word slave and they replace it with the word Negro or colored. And these are really restrictive laws that limit African Americans' right to mobility, their right to organize, their right to establish churches, where they live, et cetera. It really restricts their rights. And two of the most egregious examples of these restrictions are the vagrancy laws and the apprenticeships. And so what the vagrancy laws do is criminalize perceived African American idleness. So they're not necessarily idle because having had their labor stolen for most of their lives, they know the value of work and they know the meaning of free labor. So they are as eager to work and be paid for their labor as anyone else. But part of what the Black codes do is limit their opportunities for employment outside of the old slave system. And so if they are resisting that, or if they are perceived to not have a contract with the right planter, then they could be criminalized or they can be sort of arrested as a vagrant. And then what happens is that if they're arrested as a vagrant, they are fined. And if they can't pay the fine, which most people can't, then they are put on the auction block, as you see here in this image from Monticello, Florida. And they are sold to the highest bidder, the person who is going to pay that fee. And then they have to work off that fee under the terms that the person who buys their labor sets. So they could spend years working off a fee. And what it does is then incentivizes people to sort of target African Americans, whether they're employed or not, so that they can be convicted of vagrancy and then forced into this bounded labor. Another egregious example is going to be the apprenticeships for Black children and youth. And what they essentially do is deprive parents of their children. They keep those children in white families and in white businesses, and they extract their labor until they're the age of 21. So they deny free parents, free Black parents, their parental rights, and they retain those children and youth's labor until they reach a certain age. And so African Americans, they see this as really horrible, and many of their allies do too. But these are the Black codes. They're a testament to many white Southerners, many former Confederates' commitment to making or acknowledging slavery's abolition in name only. And the Black codes are available, they're done by state, and the Texas codes are available for anyone who sort of wants to take a look at them. So as I said, African Americans want justice after slavery is abolished. They can't get the stolen labor back, they can't get the stolen lives back. But one of the things that they make clear that they want are things like family rights. So they want their marriages recognized. They want their parental rights recognized. But in order for that to happen, there need to be laws passed that affirm and recognize their right to do this, because under slavery, they were denied. And I think this image that Thomas Nast created in 1863 is illustrative of the ideas that people have about what slavery's abolition is supposed to look like. And so on the left side, you see these scenes of slavery and the violence and the separation of families. In the center, you see African-American families, and families were critical to African Americans. It's how they survived slavery. And on the right side, you see these scenes of what freedom is supposed to mean. For many people, it's supposed to mean the exact opposite of slavery. For African Americans and their allies, it should mean the exact opposite. But that's not necessarily understood by all Americans. And so justice also looks like self-determination. African Americans should have the right to make a fair and decent living in whatever industry or career they want or have the talent for. They should have access to land. And even though they believe their stolen labor should have paid for any land they get, many of them are willing to work for it as long as the federal government will grant them access to purchase it the same way they had whites. African Americans want access to education, and because they have been denied it under slavery. And for them, education is about justice after slavery. They also want access to independent churches. So they had access to religion under slavery, but they essentially got, for the most part, the slaveholders' religion. And it wasn't perceived by African Americans and by white abolitionists to be the sort of pure or accurate Christianity. And so they want independent churches so they can practice their faith on their own and without white interference and intrusion. They also want citizenship rights, and they want voting rights and the right to serve in office. All of these amount to justice after slavery. All of the things you see here represent the exact opposite of slavery. And that's important because African Americans, having experienced slavery, one of the things that we know is that that history of enslavement gives African Americans a unique vision of what American freedom looks like. And African Americans who were free before the Civil War experienced a lot of racial discrimination in all areas of life. And so for them, what we know is that they also have this unique vision of freedom, because they've been on it from the outside, or they've been looking at it from the outside. And I like to tell my students that no one has spent more time thinking about American freedom than the people who are denied it. And that would be African Americans who are enslaved and free. And what they see is what the white population is doing, the rights, privileges, and protections they enjoy and sometimes even take for granted. African Americans insisted they should have those rights, freedoms, and privileges too. And so that unique perspective is going to put African Americans at the vanguard for reconstructing American freedom and democracy. They're going to be the people who are going to push and nudge and pressure abolitionists, former abolitionists, and progressive in Congress to recognize their right to have rights and their need to have these rights recognized by the federal government and fully defined in order to protect them from the former slaveocracy and their efforts to essentially only recognize slavery's abolition in name only. Another critical part of Reconstruction is Congressional Reconstruction. And so this happens in response to this fury over this reprisal violence we see African Americans experience at the hands of ex-Confederates, their frustration with President Johnson and his pardoning of ex-Confederates, and the Black codes. All of these, this sort of tension back and forth, result in this congressional takeover of Reconstruction. And it's led by progressive senators and congressmen like Charles Sumner. And what we're going to see them do is facilitate this rights revolution. And it's the rights revolution, it's that sense of justice that African Americans and their white allies thought they needed after slavery. And it was not only for African Americans, it was to advance the rights, protections, and privileges of all Americans going forward. So we're going to see progressive members of Congress pushed and inspired by African Americans' goals and dreams and visions of American freedom and for justice after slavery. And they're going to usher in these revolutionary reforms that are going to address the needs of not only African Americans, but all Americans. And the historian Eric Foner refers to this revolutionary era as the second founding. And it would be the second founding after the founding, the original founding of 1776, for the expansion of American freedom and democracy to more Americans than before. One of the first places where we see this happen is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It defines federal citizenship, and it says that all citizens have the same rights and protections, regardless of race. And this is revolutionary. It's the first Civil Rights Act in the history of the US, and some scholars would argue it's the first Civil Rights Act in the history of the world. It's completely revolutionary. And it's one of the things that other countries in the Americas who held people in bondage, none of them even attempted to do anything as radical or as revolutionary as this. And so it's really important for students to understand what's happening here at this moment, what they're trying to do and why. They're trying to make sure that all citizens enjoy the same rights, protections, and freedoms, regardless of race. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is also going to overturn the Black codes. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is really long. And so it's not something I would necessarily assign to K through 6 students. I'd assign it to students in my upper division undergraduate courses. But what it does is it's really detailed in terms of the rights it spells out. So African Americans now have the right to marry and to have their marital rights respected. They can reap the full benefits of their now paid labor. They can acquire land, things that they hadn't necessarily been allowed to do under slavery. They have access to jobs. They can make contracts in their own names. They can have access to education. They have the right to religious freedom, things they didn't have before. They're also going to acquire criminal justice rights, so they can sue in court. They can testify against white people who commit crimes against them, something that even Blacks who were free before the war didn't necessarily enjoy, even in states like Michigan or New York or Pennsylvania. So they'll be able to serve on juries and they'll have equal sentencing. So this is revolutionary for the time. And the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 spells all of these rights and protections out. And it says that citizens enjoy them regardless of race. What lawmakers know, progressive lawmakers know, is that for African Americans to truly enjoy these rights, and for other Americans to truly enjoy these rights, that they're going to need to make sure that these people can vote, to elect representatives, to protect these rights, and serve in office themselves. So they're going to need suffrage in addition to this. So you got this huge rights revolution with the Civil Rights Act. But the thing about the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is that with ex-Confederates returning to Congress, all it takes is a new congressional majority to bring this rights revolution to an end. And so what progressives want and insist upon is going to be the 14th Amendment, which is going to further secure Americans' rights, their citizenship definition, and protections. So it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the US and of the state wherein they reside. But it goes further, and it says that states may not deprive citizens of the right to life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and they shall not deprive citizens of equal protection of the nation's laws. And so this has implications not only for African Americans, but it protects the citizenship rights of all Americans. It's not just assume what rights you enjoy. What we see during Congressional Reconstruction is they are fully defined and spelled out. Lawmakers know, as I said, that they're going to need to make sure that African Americans and their allies, and even poor whites who were poor before the Civil War, who couldn't vote because they couldn't fulfill the property requirements, that they have the right to vote too. And so Congress is going to pass the 15th Amendment, which is going to remove the racial barriers to voting. It's going to leave the gender barriers in place, but it's going to remove the racial barriers. And what I hope we can discuss during the question and answer is what the amendment says and doesn't say, and sort of like the loopholes that are sort of in the amendment. With the vote, African Americans rush to the ballot box. Their numerical majorities in certain counties and in certain states allows them to send upwards of 600 African American men to the state legislatures or into city and county offices. While they're there, during this brief period, they implement some of the most progressive and democratic policies for their states to date. And one of the most revolutionary things they do is enact public school systems across the South. And it's completely revolutionary. And all citizens have access to this public school system, not just African Americans. Everyone does. Those numerical majorities in certain counties or in certain states allow upwards of 16 African American men to be sent to the US Congress. So this is where you get your first African American senator and then your representatives during Reconstruction. So African Americans with the vote now enjoy authority in governance. They can vote, they can serve in office, and for them, this is not something that's in the abstract. They want and need to be able to elect people into office to protect their rights and privileges and their freedom, especially because they know the former slaveocracy is desperate to stop the rights revolution. One of the last big pieces of Reconstruction, Congressional Reconstruction, is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And what it does is it prohibits racial discrimination in places of public accommodation. And so these are places that are funded by tax dollars or that participate in interstate commerce. So their schools, their parks, their inns, streetcars, trains, restaurants, hotels, etc. And so African Americans had often faced discrimination, even though they had the money to go to these places, like to go to a restaurant or go to an inn or go to a theater. They faced purely racial discrimination when they tried to access them. And that was a badge of slavery. And so what progressive members of Congress decided was that this was a badge of slavery and it was a violation of their citizenship rights. So they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which for a period of time is going to remove these restrictions that African Americans are facing. For a period of time, there is a sense of justice. African Americans' families are reunited. They're integrated into the body politic. They have rights that are spelled out. They have privileges that are spelled out. They enjoy the same rights and privileges as their white counterparts. With these rights, they're able to acquire land. They gain access to education, and they can try to transcend slavery. They establish thousands of independent churches, and they even get their own businesses off the ground. And what we know is that having had their labor stolen for more than 2 centuries, African Americans were understandably going to work harder for themselves than they would for the people who held them in bondage. So many people with these rights recognized are going to be able to, for a time, transcend this history of slavery. But there's a catch. A lack of enforcement is going to leave their enjoyment of these rights at risk. So Congress passed this legislation, and it gave itself authority to enforce it. But it was rare that they actually backed it up, at least all of these rights and protections, because they often came under assault from the former slaveocracy. So as I said, for a period of time, African Americans have a sense of justice. But I think it's important for students to know that every achievement they gain is hard won because the resistance is intense. And that resistance is not only in the South, it's across the country by people who are really invested in this idea that only white people should enjoy rights and privileges in the United States. And for many of them, they see African Americans going to Congress, African Americans acquiring land, African Americans gaining access to education and establishing their own churches and businesses as a threat to white people's supposed superiority. And so there's a lot of grievance over this. For many of them, they see freedom as a zero-sum game. If African Americans enjoy it, then somehow it must hurt white people. And so what we're going to see is that there's a drive to arrest these gains. And then as if they can't arrest them, or as they arrest them, as the insurgency against Reconstruction intensifies, they're going to unravel them as quickly as possible. Many of you have probably heard the story or the narrative of Reconstruction's failure. And I think that there are economic policies that fail, and a lot of them fail because they don't get the resources they need to be successful. But the argument or this discourse of failure around Reconstruction belies the violent overthrow by whites who are opposed to abolition and equal rights. And this is mostly in the South, but it's also aided by whites in the West and in the Northeast and in the Midwest who also don't believe that African Americans should enjoy these rights. So they're going to allow this violent overthrow to happen. Part of what we start to see are these vigilante squads that attack and kill politicians, voters, ministers, teachers, and their families. And these are not only African Americans, these are white lawmakers and their families too. African Americans and their white allies are subjected to this violence, but the vast majority of the people who are targeted in this war after the Civil War are going to be African Americans. And so they're going to go after the most successful, the Black business owners, the Black people who've acquired land or who are in the process of acquiring land, the Black politicians, the ministers of churches, the teachers, all of those people who are trying to help make freedom real. So they're going to target them with violence. And it's going to be crushing violence, incessant from 1867 until Reconstruction ends, and then even afterwards. What we also see during this period is that not only are there these individual attacks, but there start to become these mass killing events. And so you see numerous massacres. And the image that you see here is of the Colfax massacre in 1873. But there are numerous massacres, and you've got plenty of instances where there are these white mobs that are rampaging through towns. All of this violence is common. And there's little to no accountability. Federal troops may be sent to one area, they may be sent to the worst areas, but then the violence will stop in that area and pick up in another area. And what you see is a lack of will and a lack of interest in disturbing the peace. And I like to put that in scare quotes because African Americans are not enjoying peace. There's little interest in sort of doing anything to bring this violence to an end. And so it continues. And it compromises these elections in the South. And it enables ex-Confederates and their allies to return to power. And when they return to power, they roll back all of the rights and protections African Americans gained. So this is why we need to sort of think about and interrogate this discourse about Reconstruction failing. And acknowledge what we're talking about, what failed and why, but not skirt around the issues of it being violently overthrown. So the rights and privileges that African Americans enjoyed are unraveled. And so without enforcement, the revolution is unfinished. This rights revolution is unfinished. And I think the sort of sentiment that happens during this period is magnified eventually by the Supreme Court, which is essentially going to, it's a very conservative Supreme Court, which is essentially going to invalidate some of the rights and protections that African Americans enjoy, including the requirement that states enforce laws like the laws on murder and prosecute those who killed African Americans in some of these mass killing events. What the Supreme Court says is that the federal government can't step in because states should do it, even though states had not been doing it. So by the time President Rutherford B. Hayes comes into office, Reconstruction has been over for a while. And it's all over but the shouting. But the violence is still continuing. So the revolution, this rights revolution, is undone. And I think the sort of sentiment is represented best by W.E.B. Du Bois, who says, describing this era, the Negro went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery. Now, I think that when we teach students this, we need to make sure that students understand that African Americans did not literally go back to slavery. But because of Reconstruction's overthrow, they weren't as free as they had been during those periods where they enjoyed their rights. African Americans never forget all that they achieved during Reconstruction, or the betrayals, the fact that the federal government and that their fellow citizens did not stop the violence and the denial of their rights and protections. And so they never forget this era. But as they're losing their rights and protections, there's this refrain. And I think it's represented by Congressman Joseph Rainey, who says, the Negro will never rest until he gets his rights. And they didn't. Even after African Americans lose their rights, they continue to fight on. And they're going to continue fighting for another century in what will become the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights era in the 1960s. But what we know is that all of those rights that African Americans are fighting for in the 1950s and the 1960s are going to go back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. In all of the cases that are being litigated that go to the Supreme Court or that land on the president's desk in terms of executive orders, all of them go back to the promises that were made during Reconstruction and the acknowledgement that states had violated those promises, Southern states had violated those promises, and that it was the federal government's responsibility to step in and address it because those states were in violation of the Constitution. So African Americans are going to drive that fight. And I think that's it. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.